Namaste friends, Hari Om. This is Yogeshwar Shastri and welcome to the sixth part of the series on British revenue extortion in Bharat. So again, just to repeat, this is based on my article which was first published on my blog, and I have given the link in the description, and this is the sixth part of the series. So if you're not seen the earlier ones, please do go and watch them because they will give the background. Now, this video might be a little herky-jerky because I'm experimenting with a couple of open source tools. So I no longer subscribe to Microsoft Office, so I'm not using PowerPoint. I'm using a free version, open source version, which is similar to Office called LibreOffice. So we'll see how that goes. So I'll probably figure out how to add my video next time around. But for this session, we'll just do without my face on the screen. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Now the reason I have given this consolidated data from 1802 to 1947-48 on this slide because I wanted to point out something about data which is quite interesting and which can mislead you if you don't analyze data correctly. So in the next part of the series I'll move on to the different British revenue systems, but for this part we just understand an overall consolidated view. So depending on how you look at data, you will either draw the correct conclusions or you might fall into a ditch because you take data at its face value and just draw the obvious conclusions, which usually are wrong. So it's like you're looking at a crystal clear lake, maybe Mansarovar or any other lake in the Himalayas, where the water is very clear and you can see the bottom of the lake. So it's very deceptive because you think it's actually very shallow lake, but if you step in you might possibly drown because it's very deep. So you should not be taken by the surface looks of things. And there was a very good jingle when I was growing up. I think this was for one of the leading software companies. It was called Dikhave pe mat jao, apni akal lagao, which means you don't go by looks but use your brains and analyze, and that's very true. So looking at this graph, so this shows the land revenue per acre in terms of rupees. Okay, so if you look at this, it doesn't look there was a lot of burden on the farmer. So for the whole period from 1801 till 1947, it comes to around 2 rupees 80 paise per acre in terms of land revenue or tax. So that doesn't look a lot. Okay, yeah, the British didn't tax us a lot, so they were good beneficial rulers, etc., etc. And there are two different things. So if you look at the chart, there's a blue line which shows land revenue per acre based on estimated cultivated area. Okay, so usually there was an estimate done. Okay, so this much area in this district is cultivated, and there was another which was land under actual cultivation. So land under actual cultivation was always lower than the estimated cultivated area. Okay, because the British usually pegged it quite high because they didn't want to miss that last rupee of revenue. So they were always afraid till the end of the rule that we are missing out on some big treasure or stash hidden somewhere. And the orange line in the graph is the land revenue per acre based on actual cultivated area. Okay, so you can see, so it's obviously going to be higher because the actual cultivated area was lower. Okay, so the rupees loaded per acre in terms of tax obviously goes up. Now you can see this kind of fluctuates between roughly 2 rupees and 5 rupees for most of the 148 years. And the biggest spike is obviously around 1857-58 where it hits roughly little more than 5 rupees per acre for based on the actual cultivated area. And other than that, is mostly fluctuates between 2 and 3 rupees per acre. Okay, so you might think, Are bhai, what is the big burden on there? It's 2 rupees per acre or whatever. So if a farmer has, at that point of time, there was massive fragmentation of land. So there weren't many holdings which were like thousands and thousands of acres. Most of the farmers, especially of the Rayotwari system, which was around 80%, was really couple of acres, so they could barely sustain. So it doesn't look like a lot of huge burden. But then the question you need to ask yourself is this the right way of looking at data? Okay, so what seems obvious, is that right? Now Dharampal, again on whose research all of this is based. So I have created the graphs, and as I pointed out in my article as well, I filled in gaps of around 30 to 40 years. Other than that, Dharampal had pretty much given almost data set for 150 years. So Dharampal in his notes, and I've got given the link and the reference to the notes in the article itself. So he has pointed out that the correct way of understanding the magnitude and the burden that the land revenue imposed by the British on the farmers is to look at not in terms of rupees per acre, but in terms of converting it into an equivalent quantity of grain, i.e., paddy. So, for those who are not aware, paddy is unhusked rice. So, once you remove the covering, and so the rice grain is inside. So, the paddy weight is always going to be a little more than the equivalent rice weight, because you've got the husk and everything which is taken out. So when you convert the rupees into an equal amount of paddy, so whatever kilos of paddy that might be, this quantity gives a rough idea of why farmers were bled to death during the British occupation. So looking at the second graph, so this is the Rayatwari land revenue in terms of kilos of paddy. Okay, and again, for this article and series, I have focused on Rayatwari, or Ryotwari as it was called, because it constituted 80% of the land revenue. The rest 20% was split majoritarily between Zamindari, and then you had the Inamdari. So looking at the graph for the first 60 years of British occupation, which was around 1801 to 1860. So the farmer was converting anywhere between 30 to 53% of his produce per acre into cash to pay the British revenue demand. So if you look at the kilograms of paddy needed to pay land revenue per acre, it kind of fluctuates roughly between, so there is a dip around 1812, 1813, because there was a massive famine in the district. So nothing could be collected. Okay. Other than that, usually seeds spike somewhere between 150 and 250. So that's kind of the band till 1860, when there's a 1857, 58, when there's a big dip. Now, assuming the average produce of paddy per acre, so what the farmer was able to get out of the land was 547 kilos. Okay, so I've based this estimate on Dharampal's estimates primarily, and then you've got different estimates which I'll talk about in later videos. So the farmer had to forego roughly around 273 kilos as revenue to the British occupation. So again, like I said, between 30 to 53% of produce was going to pay the revenue. This is a huge amount, and you need to add different costs of cultivation, such as rent to the landlord, because remember, a lot of these people had micro plots, 1 acre, 2 acres, and they were actually renting it out from a bigger landlord. So they had to pay rent to the landlord, wastage. It's not like you produce 500 odd kilos and everything, you can utilize everything. Farming, agriculture doesn't work that way. There's a lot of wastage as well. You have to take a little bit out for the survival of the farmer and his family to feed themselves. So if you add on the cost of cultivation, or subtract on the cost of cultivation, so from the roughly 200 odd kilos left, there's hardly anything left for as profit. Forget profit, even for their own survival. And this is the reason why there was a massive die out of farmers and generally the rural peasantry, even in South India. In all parts of India this happened, but we are particularly focusing on Tirunelveli district, which is in Tamil Nadu. And this went on for the first 60 years. Now, the average life expectancy in British period was roughly between 20 to 24 years. So you are easily looking at roughly 2 to 3 generations of people who were literally reduced to eating scraps. And after 1860s, the revenue demand goes down, but you have to understand that by this point, people had been completely pauperized. Millions of acres of land had become wasteland. Land productivity and fertility had gone down to the floor. Okay, so even when it looks very low, when it has kind of crashed into the 50 kilos of paddy per acre, by this time even that 50 kilos of paddy was equivalent to the 200 odd which they were converting to cash to be the revenue in the first 60 years. So everything has to be looked at in the correct perspective. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So now the problem of the yield per acre, this is again a very big conundrum. So even in British time and after British time, a lot of scholars have kind of been banging their heads trying to derive the ideal yield per acre. Okay, now I assume the yield per average produce per acre as 547 kilos over 150 years. This is based on Dharmpal's figure because again, like I said, fertility of the soil crashed during British time because farmers did not have enough money even to get the manure, fertilizers to kind of replenish the soil. The British assumptions of yield from the very beginning were unrealistically high. Okay, and the land tax was set to these figures. So see, in 1801, we kind of look at how the Anglo-Saxon world is in our present time, say 2020s or whatever, and we kind of tend to project that back, which is a very wrong thing to do. So at that point, the British did not have any advanced kind of mechanism or means or electronic surveillance, anything like that, to get the exact yield and the exact number of acres in any particular district that were cultivated. So what they did was they simply pegged it at a very unrealistically high level. So if a farmer had 10 acres, what they used to assume was all 10 acres was equally productive. In reality, it doesn't happen that way because out of that, maybe 5 acres are being farmed, 3 acres are grazing ground, 2 acres are wasteland, and that kind of thing. So it's not like 10 acres are going to be productive, and even in the 5 acres, that whole land won't be equally productive. But this was the assumption they made because their only concern was to kind of suck the last kind of penny or rupee or paise out of Indian farmers. And the land tax, as I've said, was set to unrealistically high levels, and this formed the basis of the tax demand. So Professor M.S. Jain has written a very excellent book on revenue extortion by the British in Ajmer district. And it used to be called as Ajmer Marwara, I think, at that point of time. So in Ajmer, even as the early 1900s, the assumed yield per acre was on average 23% more than the actual yield. Okay, so we are talking about early 1900s, so 1910, 1915. Now, if you kind of move back 100 years, you can imagine how much higher they had set the demand. Okay. And this figure is quite important because land revenue, there were different mechanisms to fix land revenue. So one was permanent settlement, where a figure was fixed and that would continue for say 20 years or 30 years. And different variations of permanent settlement were implemented, even the Rayatwari system. So a demand was fixed for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, based on the gross yield per acre. Okay, again a very deceptive figure. And for almost like 100 plus years, this was mostly guesswork of the British officials and their native collaborators. Okay, so peons and all the agricultural officials. And even the land under cultivation was itself a guesswork, as I have pointed out in the previous slides. Because the British administration simply wasn't willing to expend the money and the resources involved to get an accurate picture of how much was cultivated. So what they used to do was peg it at very high levels. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And so while land tax was very high, this is only part of the picture. Now, when I was showing the graphs, I mentioned something called the cost of cultivation. Now I basically come from an agricultural family, but I haven't had any touch with agriculture. I grew up in a city. So my knowledge of agriculture only comes from listening to random stuff and going to the village once a year when I was a child, but that's hardly enough to give you in education agriculture. So when I was going through Dharmpal's documents and other stuff, I came across this figure of the cost of cultivation not being taken into account. And I was reading a book by Raghava Engar, who's written a book called Memorandum of Progress in the Madras Presidency. I think that's the name of the book. You can find it on Internet Archive. This was published in 1898. So he was a very high official in the British administration. And he keeps talking about the cost of cultivation. I couldn't understand what is the cost of cultivation. So this is really the total expenses incurred on farming. And it's taken as a percentage of the total return or income of the farmer. So if a farmer earns 100 rupees from 1 acre, the cost of cultivation is subtracted from that to get the profit. So it's pretty much like, when you are running a business, to get the net profit, which is a net profit which is important, you subtract all the costs of running the business. So electricity, rent of premises, employing people, their salaries, and then you get the final figure, which is your net profit. So cost of cultivation is something similar. So it includes both the fixed and the variable costs. So my sister, Dr. Archana Kare, she helped me understand this figure, and I used the cost of cultivation reports for different years brought out by the government of independent India. And I have picked the cost of cultivation at a conservative 70%. Excuse me. And my assumption is quite close to that of the 19th century. And this is attested by the figures given by Latouche, who was a British government officer in Ajmer region in 1870s. And again, this statistic is derived from Professor Jain's book. So he gives the underestimated figure of around 67% as the cost of cultivation in Ajmer area. And typically the cost of cultivation can fluctuate between 70 to 80%. Even in independent India, we are talking about 90s and 2000s. So cost of cultivation in modern India is split into 14 different categories. So I've only given 7 categories to avoid cluttering up the screen, and some of them are not applicable in the present age. So some of the categories which are common across the centuries is really value of hired human labor to work in the fields, value of hired bullock labor if you don't own that. Nowadays obviously it's all tractors. So value of owned bullock labor, value of owned machinery labor. So machinery wasn't really relevant at that point of time, and hired machinery charges. So some of these are modern. Value of seed, again this was relevant at that point as well, because farmers had to buy seed. Value of insecticide, pesticide is not relevant now. In that age, but relevant now. So 14 categories, but you can imagine that in the early years of British occupation, no allowance was made for the farmer's cost of cultivation or even his profit. So it was only after the 1850s when farmers were reduced to really dire straits, and this was after almost 50-60 years of severe distress, that the British made small deductions, usually in the range of 15 to 20%, and even this was made usually in terms of famine when millions had already died. So this was kind of, okay, we'll let you guys survive. And Raghava Engar, in his book, on the Memorandum of Progress in the Madras Presidency, he is quite honest, because he says, I'm quoting him, the settlement calculations do not make allowances for the liability of the Rayat or the farmer to pay a fixed cash assessment in all seasons, whether the crop he reaps is abundant or so scanty as to be hardly sufficient for his subsistence. So Raghav Engar was a very trusted official of the British administration, and typically the book was written to kind of as a response to the criticism that the British administration was bleeding the farmers dry, and it was heartless, inhuman, and so on and so forth. But he's quite honest. Obviously he couldn't write everything, because at the end of the day this was signed off by the British officials, and this was printed by the government printing press in Madras and so on. So he's as honest as he can be. Okay, so for this part, that's pretty much it. And next time we will start looking at the Amani system. So this was the first British revenue extortion system put in place from 1801 to, I think it went on for around 10-12 years. So we'll start looking at each of the revenue systems for the next 3 or 4 parts. Okay friends, I hope you like the video, and if you like, please do remember to share, like, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Hari Om.